If your drawings are flat, muddied, or lacking dimension, focus on developing your contrast. Now be sure to stick around until the end and I'll give you a few tips to make seeing contrast in your reference images easier, particularly in those muddier areas. Now, contrast, I would say, is one of the top few things to consider when you're drawing a scene. Second to light, because of course without light you can't see anything, but contrast is built on how that light is interacting with every detail of your scene. Contrast is formed where two different values come together. Every part of your drawing is created by contrast. Because if there's no contrast, you really aren't going to see any objects in your scene. Here is a drawing I did that has no contrast. Not very exciting. Contrast is how we perceive form, textures, depth. So on our pencil value scale here, if the two values are close together, there will only be a slight amount of contrast, and this can make those areas of your drawing feel a little bit flatter, while areas that have values from opposite ends of our value scale have higher contrast, and those parts of your drawings will have more pop. They're often more visually interesting and will pull viewers in. Now when we first start a drawing, we'll often outline all the forms and different shapes in our drawing. And that is perfectly normal. That's how I start almost every drawing, sketching in my forms and my outlines. But of course, lines don't exist in reality, right? Where a lot of those lines are hitting, you're actually just outlining areas of contrast. These are areas where different values come together to form all the definitive shapes and textures of our drawing. Now, when you're choosing a scene to draw, scenes that have higher contrast are easier to draw because it's easier to distinguish the wider range between the brightest areas and the darkest areas. Now, all of this is not to say low contrast is necessarily a bad thing. There are plenty of reasons to draw something with low contrast. For example, if you were drawing this moody, foggy scene of this deer, low contrast will help pull that off. But conversely to the high contrast being easy to decipher, low contrast can often be tougher to distinguish and replicate because the values making up these scenes or areas are closer together on our value scale, making it not only harder to recognize but also recreate. Another example of low contrast working to your benefit is creating depth. Hazy details in the distance often have less contrast. And one final example, the texture of vegetation is often created when you're using values that are relatively close together that have low contrast. So there are plenty of good reasons to draw entire scenes or parts of your drawing that have lower contrast. Now here are some tips in being able to see and distinguish contrast in your reference images easier. Now any image software on your computer should allow you to do these tricks. You can even do these on your phone if you go to the Edit tab on your image. So first you want to turn it black and white. And if you don't have a simple button to do this easily, go to the saturation slider bar and just bring that down. So you can see the areas with the highest contrast are the easiest to distinguish how you would translate and draw that on your paper. It's the other areas with lower contrast that are more difficult. One trick here is to bring the exposure of your entire image up. Then we're going to crank up the contrast slider and bring up our whites slider bar, as well as bring down our black slider bar. And you'll see everything is going to pop out a little bit more. What we're doing essentially is exaggerating the contrast to make it easier to decipher and translate to our drawing. So play around with these adjustments to make the contrast easier to see, and it's going to be slightly different each time depending on your reference image. Now another trick, if you are working on an area that has some really complex contrast, try covering up the majority of your reference image so you're just focusing on one small area. Oftentimes, viewing the full scene with the complex textures and shapes can be overwhelming, and it's a bit harder to decipher the contrast. So this focuses you in so you can get a handle on creating the contrast in just that small area. Then as you develop your technique in just that small little section, you can expand out to your full drawing with a clearer idea of how to approach building that contrast. Contrast is the language of clarity in your drawing. As you get better at drawing, honing your ability to see and develop contrast is crucial.